I'll call the meeting to order for the West Hollywood Rent Stabilization Commission meeting on January 25th. Could we please stand and the Pledge of Allegiance?
Pledge of allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Could we have a roll call?
Commissioner Maggio.
Present.
Commissioner Gregoire. Commissioner Topchin.
Here.
Commissioner Charity.
Here.
Commissioner Buckles.
Present.
Vice Chair Bergstein.
Here.
Chair Kirpies.
Here. All right, has everyone had a chance to look at the agenda tonight?
Move to approve as submitted.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right, we have an agenda. And minutes for the January 11th meeting, if we all had a chance to review those. Are there any changes?
Let's see, there were only 4 of us are present for those minutes, I believe. I would make a motion to approve the minutes of January 11th.
Do we have a second?
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
I'm going to abstain.
All right.
And I
Commissioner
think,
Bergstein would like to abstain.
You have as an abstention.
I have also abstained.
And Commissioner Buckles also abstains. Now we'll move into public comments. Doesn't look like we have many in the house tonight. And Director's Manager's Report.
Thank you. Good evening, Chair, members of the Commission. Just reviewing your calendar for the next few meetings. The February 8th meeting, again, has been canceled for lack of quorum. And so the next meeting following this meeting will be February 22nd. You do have an appeal that evening. You do have also on the agenda 2 items, both of which are recommendations to the City Council, one of which is to adopt an ordinance establishing tenant habitability requirements during renovations. And the other one is an ordinance establishing tenant buyout agreements. On March 8th, there are 2 appeals, and you then have a review of the upward rent adjustment for seismic retrofitting, and if desired, at that meeting, the Commission would formulate a recommendation for any changes that you see fit for the city's current process. Now, this is the topic of the study session this evening, and so the Commission will be learning more about this. This is the initial kickoff this evening of this process. Staff are going to go, we're going to go out to the community. Once we hear from the Commission this evening, we're going to receive information from the community, and then we will bring that back to you at the March meeting. March 22nd, there is no appeals that night, and remember that is the meeting where we're doing a special meeting in Plummer Park. So this concludes my report.
I think I have a question.
Do you have any questions? Commissioner Maggio?
Peter, could you remind me why we didn't want to break up these topics on the 22nd? They were required? Because it seems like it's a lot of work, those 2 topics, but...
We were hoping that we could bring those forward at the same meeting at this time. We would like to move those forward to the Council in March if possible. Of course, if the Commission does review those items and if the Commission does feel that you would like more time, you're certainly able to do that, and you can take more time to review those items. The calendar is set up as it is. If the Commission does feel that you can make a recommendation on these 2 ordinances, we would move them, advance them to the Council in March, and they would be in place shortly at the beginning, near the beginning of April, or somewhere in mid-April, which is near when the seismic retrofitting requirements are taking effect. And the importance of doing that, gauging that, those 2 timelines, is that these 2 ordinances are really part of the tenant protections that we'd like to get in place. so that we are assured that as seismic retrofitting, and in fact any other major capital improvements are done, that it's done in a way that maintains and preserves habitability at the property, and that there are some guidelines established if in fact there's any form of tenant buyouts or negotiations that are happening along with that retrofitting, or parallel with the retrofitting or capital improvement process. So I was a little long-winded. I think the summary of it is that if the commission's willing, I'd like to keep them on that meeting. However, you certainly don't have to make a recommendation that evening, and you could put those items you could continue them to another meeting until you're comfortable with making a decision.
I guess also I was concerned about the public hearing, how complicated it might be, how long it would take.
Yeah, and that's a fair concern. Again, I'm open to the commission's decision on where those items land. I would recommend at this point to leave them on the meeting, and that the commission assess the depth of those items. If in fact the appeal ends up being a dense appeal and the commission wants to continue those items, you certainly don't have to even hear the item. You could simply just continue it to another meeting.
I think the other question too was, and I think maybe we discussed why we could not use the February 8th date to fill in.
I think because we already announced that that was going to be canceled due to lack of quorum.
Yeah, and so to remind, the commission felt that there was a lack of quorum because that evening the Lesbian, Gay, Transgender Advisory Board wanted to use this chamber for a televised meeting.
Okay, yes.
So Commissioner Maggi, would you be comfortable with the fact that we will leave this calendars as it currently appears, and if it turns out the appeals go longer than a normal appeal, if there is such a thing, and if these become too far in depth at that meeting, we can then reschedule it, and the public will be noticed at that time in the future whenever we appear on the calendar. Would you be comfortable with that?
Yes, I would. It's a lot of work, and I think there's a lot of discussion, and we want to give it a fair shake. So, but I will go along with what the commission feels would be right on the February 22nd meeting.
Are there any other questions for manager? All right, thank you. And we'll move into commission comments. Nothing. No comments? I just want to say that I did had an opportunity to attend the building blocks seminar last week, held at Plummer Park for tenants. I think it was the Tenants 101. I got there a few minutes late, but when I walked in, there was several people there. It was well attended. They had a lot of good questions, and I think Elena and David did an excellent job at that, and they stuck around for quite a while afterwards because people had individual questions one-on-one that they wanted to ask them. So if you could pass on our appreciation to them for spending their extra time doing that, that's great.
Chair, when is the next meeting? I know that it's supposed to be like 2 meetings.
Next tenants building blocks one. The next one is the advanced one, I believe, and I think it's the 20. I was going to say 23rd, but it's already passed.
Yeah.
Maybe that was the one that I went to.
Okay.
I think Peter will look for that
Yes,
and let us know during the...
It's this next week on Tuesday, so they happen sequentially in 2-week increments on the same day, Tuesday. So this one will be the follow-up. The advanced is on January 30th.
And what time?
At all the meetings are at 7 p.m. They're in Plummer Park, and so that's the second one for the tenants. And then shortly after that, it's worth mentioning that the landlord basics in advance will begin on February 6th, and then February 13th.
Same place, same time?
Place, same time.
Okay, thank you.
No other commissioner comments? If not, then we'll move into our new business. And Mr. Newton, would you like to give us a staff report on our study session? We're having a study session, I guess, this evening for the upward rent adjustments for seismic retrofitting and approaches used by other rent stabilization programs.
Sure. So I've prepared a very brief PowerPoint. I know that I provided the commission with a 10-page staff report with, I think, 77 pages of attachments, 3 prior hearings. And I did that yesterday. We had a little, it just took us a little time to get that staff report together. So to be sensitive to the commission, I'd have kind of organized some of the summary of that staff report in this PowerPoint presentation. The intent this evening and the PowerPoint is to help perhaps elucidate or generate some conversation and some feedback from the commission this evening. I hadn't intended to go in depth into the 3 different hearings, but to provide the commission with exposure to what those hearings looked like, what the depth of the information that landlords provided was, and what the calculations looked like. Because part of this whole process of upward rent adjustments is a understanding why, even though seismic retrofitting and capital improvements are occurring in the city now, and the process is not used, and we want to understand better why it's not being used. And so there could be a number of different reasons, one of which could potentially be the approach. So that being said, I think I'll just go ahead and jump in here. What is really, and I should say, please stop me and ask questions in the presentation.
I just wanted to ask, just before you get started, just so people that might be watching, can you kind of just give us an idea, like, so this plays into these public meetings that are going to be held as well, right, in the next month or so, in terms of soliciting feedback from the public?
Sure, absolutely. We did provide in December 16th. We provided the council with an update on this process. We are preparing for a number of different community engagement events. Now, what this is all related to, for the commission's benefit and those watching, is the city council adopted a mandatory seismic retrofitting requirement. And that requirement for soft-story buildings takes effect on April 1st of 2018. Now, the work doesn't have to begin on April 1st. It's important to know. That's just the date that the ordinance takes effect. The trigger point is that a landlord will receive a notice from the city that their building has been identified as a soft-story structure, and they're required to complete an engineering report for the building, an assessment of the building. And if there's any seismic issues identified in that engineering report, that they're required to make those improvements, address those issues within 5 years. On August 7th, an ordinance goes into effect for non-ductile concrete and pre-Northridge steel motion frame buildings. Please don't ask me to describe what those are.
That's one of my questions. What's non-ductile? Or is that just a technical term?
Well, it's the buildings that aren't ductile.
Bada-boom.
Sorry. I'm not an engineer. I'm not the building official. So, but perhaps we can provide some photos or imagery of what that looks like, because I would like to know myself, honestly.
Pre-Northridge steel, I can figure that one out on my own.
I think that you might imagine that these are the larger buildings. The soft story buildings are easier to describe. These are the buildings that have the larger entrances or the parking, tuck under parking in a portion in the front or on the sides of the buildings. The non-ductile concrete pre-Northridge steel motion frame, I've been kind of using a visual of the older, perhaps more historic, larger apartment buildings, the ones that are over 3 stories tall, as being those. But I will confirm that with our building official. So those, once a notice is received, those property owners have 20 years to make those improvements. And the reason that it's 20 rather than 5 is that the costs on those upgrades may potentially be much larger, and the work might be more in-depth, more complicated than with the soft story structures. So first and foremost, we are looking at customer service. The city provides a high level of customer service. We do focus on a very strong level of engagement with tenants and with property owners. And so we want to make sure that we can provide that level of customer service as this goes forward. And so we're currently assessing our needs. And we're really looking broad perspective, not only on providing information on the seismic retrofitting, which is certainly going to be mainly, first and foremost, through the Building and Safety Office, but our Rent Stabilization and Housing Office will certainly have many questions, and those questions will relate to kind of the bulk of this presentation and the aspects of passing through any costs, the habitability, as I mentioned, the buyouts. So that being said, once again, on February 22nd, we are going to be looking at that and those two items. That is going to essentially add a little bit of a workload to us, but I think that this is ultimately going to be a good thing for our rent stabilization ordinance, and it's a good thing, both for landlords and tenants, to be quite honest with you, because I'm a big proponent of being clear on expectations, and if you're clear on expectations, there's a better chance that everyone's going to meet those expectations. So developers, contractors, if they know the upfront requirements for habitability, I think that we'll have good compliance. So, upward rent adjustments. Just a summary statement, it's pretty simple. They become part of the maximum allowable rent. And what the upward rent adjustment process does is it is a process that a landlord they can apply for it now. It's an application. They can request an upward rent adjustment based on the fact that their revenues that they're receiving from the property are lower than their costs, and so their costs are exceeding their income. The process requires them to justify that, and that process is called NOI, net operating income. If you've looked at the attachments, you've seen that how complex and the amount of information that we've asked for in the past. We really have taken the landlords to task to prove their finances. So this is one aspect in consideration of the current process, is that it in fact becomes part of the rent. There's another approach that the City of LA uses, San Francisco uses, which is a direct cost, it's a cost recovery pass-through, which is not part of the rent. It's a separate charge, very similar to, if you will, our annual fee pass-through of, I believe, $6 at this point per month that a landlord can pass through to the tenant. So,
I have a question on that.
yes, please do.
So if an upward rent adjustment becomes part of the MAR permanently, what would the situation be if, such in the case as a large item as a earthquake retrofit or complete replumbing of a building or roofing, some of those older items, if the landlord recaptures through that upward rent adjustment the entire cost that they outlay, why would the tenant then be paying a higher MAR when the landlord had then since recovered all the costs at a certain point? It might take years, but that's my concern with that becoming a permanent part of the MAR.
Right, so the formula does use a 30-year amortization rate for those costs. And so through the calculations, essentially I do have a slide on the calculation, so maybe we can hold it.
A jump ship, sorry.
It's probably not going to be as in-depth as you may want to go, and I'll just warn you now, but maybe we can have a look at that slide and see if that helps with some of those questions, because good questions.
So I think my question's the same thing, but just worded a little bit differently, is do you know why, that was my same concern, and do you know why we went that route versus saying, this is how much it costs, let's divide it up? And
Yeah.
so at some point, if you
Yeah,
guys-
we can
It might
help
be
you
that
with
slide later, I don't know.
Before we get there, importantly, I want to point out that currently this approach that we have, the upward rent adjustment, does not have any hardship exemption for tenants. And I think that that's a concern. And the reason that it's a concern, that it wasn't a concern in the past, let me tell you why I don't think it was a concern in the past. When we had pure rent control, if the tenant received rents that they could not, a rent increase they couldn't pay, and you can see on the slide, the current program, the only limitations that it has is that the rent can't increase by more than 12% in the first and second years. So if you have really large costs incurred and you have a rent adjustment that is ordered, that is, you could have the entire rent increase applied, and if it's 24%, that's applied in the first 2 years, and then any balance is applied in the next year, year 3. Now, the reason it probably wasn't as much a concern when we had rent control is because tenants had more of an ability to move and stay within the community because we were able to control those rents at vacancy. So if you can imagine, when a unit became vacant, tenants found it easier to just transfer to another unit within the community. That's not the case anymore, and so I think that we need to look at a hardship exemption. Both San Francisco and Los Angeles have that hardship exemption in there. Although they have a direct cost pass-through, they have instituted an exemption as well. So that's one of the items. I'm open to hearing any comments and thoughts on that, but we certainly are going to be exploring a number of different parameters related to
Peter,
the exemption.
I'm sorry, Peter. Yeah, the rent increases are limited to 12%, you mentioned, right? The first 2 years, and then 10% for the third year, based on the
No, look
NOI?
at that first line. There's 2 parts there. So rent increases are limited to 12% per year for the first 2 years. Any remaining balance goes into effect year 3. Annual interest at a rate of 10% is added to all deferred rent increases. So there's the 12% that's added the first year, the balance has a 10% added to it. There's the additional 12% added in the second year, and then a 10% increase is added onto that third amount. And so it's really allowing any deferral to increase at 10%. So we don't know what the ultimate cost could be for the seismic retrofitting. And it's not that we haven't done the work, it's simply that the requirements for seismic retrofitting are going to be unique to each building, and it's going to be specific to the needs of that building. And so we really won't know ultimately what the costs are until those engineering reports start coming in and the work starts to be done.
But am I right in thinking that that's like a 10% finance charge? Like I'm paying a 10%, if I'm the tenant on the deferred balance, I'm paying a 10% interest rate on that balance that I'm not being charged now.
That is accurate.
And then you said it's limited to 12% per year for the first 2 years. Then you said that's 24%. Actually, it's more than that because the first year it would be 12% of whatever the MAR was that year. And then the second year, the MAR is already 12% higher than the previous year. So it's actually 12% and 12%. 12% of the first year, then 12% of that higher rent the second year. So it's not exactly a 24% increase. Is that correct?
I think you said 12% of MAR, is that right?
Correct.
So it's 12% of the rent increase ordered, not the MAR. It's added to the MAR. So
again,
if
please.
the rent increase is $300,
Yep.
it would be 12% of that $300 is applied the first year to the MAR. Another 12% of that $300 is applied the second year. And then the balance, 76% of that $300 is applied in the third year.
I'm sorry, I thought it was 12% of the MAR was going up each year.
No,
it's
it's
12% of that allowable.
Of the rent increase ordered by the hearings examiner.
Thank you.
Right. Now, I used $300 as an example. I can tell you in the past, the rent increases have been very small. However, we've only had very limited cases for seismic retrofitting, and we haven't had a lot of experience with the level of retrofitting that is going to come through in the next 5 years. So that's a reason that we flagged this. We think it's important given that we've had rent decontrol. We have these changing dynamics in the housing market in West Hollywood. We don't want people to inadvertently lose their housing because we're making the building safer. Mm-hmm. So this kind of touches on some of what I was just talking about, but it also raises another point because so far there's going to be a policy. There's a little bit of policy that should be contemplated here in this item. And we'll see that a little bit more in, I believe, the next slide. But there's really, when we look at the different programs out there that cities are using, the NOI formula versus the cost recovery. NOI requires the property owner to justify that they need to raise the rents, that they need to prove that they need to raise the rents to make an income. And we know with versus cost recovery, which just assumes that the landlord does need the pass-through to make the improvements. Now, part of this consideration is here on this slide. With Costa-Hawkins in place, we looked at what the rent increases have been, and it's essentially been, there's been a 92% increase in rents between 1999 and 2015, and that works out to a 4.4% annual increase in rents. Now, that's not every single apartment, mind you, but that's average when we look at all of the rents that have been, the increases that have come in. So it's part of the information that we're collecting, and we really want to better understand the need versus the if you will, the want. But we also need to make sure that the work is going to be done. Landlords will stay in business. They will continue to rent their buildings. We do need to maintain and preserve our RSO. We don't need to establish a process through our mandatory seismic retrofitting that really encourages redevelopment. So I think that there's a lot of balancing that we need to look at, but certainly we do need to look at the fact that landlords have been able to increase their rents above the RSO limitations as one of those considerations.
Peter, for a question for a hypothetical scenario, if the unit is vacant and the landlord completed the retrofit work and then re-rented the unit, obviously we presume that re-rented at the market rate. So there won't be any rent increase, right, apply for, if the owner would apply for that unit, there wouldn't be any rent increase approved.
Yeah, that's exactly correct. And in fact, in any of the programs that the cities use, any of the pass-through or the rent increases essentially go away with the new tenancy. Okay. The new tenant is presumed to be at market income, market rent, and that the market rent includes costs for maintaining the building.
Cost recovery, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So this is the slide, Commissioner Bergstein, that I alluded to. It does have more information. It probably does not have the depth that you were looking for because I didn't provide any of the calculation examples in this presentation. I'm happy to do that, and perhaps if the Commission wants to look at some of those examples, the Commission could suggest a future meeting that we could yet do bring this item back with some more numbers, and we could just look at the numbers and the calculations. But just a simple overview of the upward rent adjustment process. The base year for NOI, net operating income, is set at 1983. Alternative years can be used with justification. It should be known, but you should know about 100 buildings so far have established their NOI for 1983, and so those buildings would be using that 1983 base. So how the formula essentially works is that we look at that base year net operating income, which is a dollar amount, and then we calculate the adjusted base year NOI. And we calculate the adjusted base year NOI by multiplying the base year NOI by 1.6 times the change in CPI. So we're increasing the base NOI by 60% of the change in the consumer price index. Now, if the income off the building is higher than that adjusted base NOI, no rent increases are ordered. If the income off the building is less, then the hearings examiner would order rent increases to bring the income to 60% of the change in CPI.
Quick question.
Yes.
I know we had an example of a situation where the individual wasn't able to get the rent increase, but we had two that they were. Right now, we allow rent increases to go at 0.75% of annual CPI, right? We allow increases of rent up to 0.75%
Annual adjustment.
The,
of the annual adjustment, I'm sorry.
well, the allowable, the annual general adjustment is, it's correct, it's set at 0.75 of CPI rounded to the nearest quartile, meaning that it's never it's either 0, it's 0.25, 0.5, 0.75.
So under that calculation, the only way that somebody would be able to prove a decreased, well, I don't know if I'm using NOI right, but they would show a decrease in profits is if for some years they didn't allow or they didn't charge the increase to their tenants. And there wasn't any, oh, never mind. There's also other
Wait, say that again?
factors. There's other factors that increase your operations.
Yeah, and you have to remember too that it's really, it's where this number comes from. It didn't come from air. There's a gentleman, Kenneth Barr, who is attributed with essentially doing a lot of the initial calculations on rent stabilization. He ran calculations, I believe, for the first 3 quarters of the last century and determined that on a national basis, the average increase that landlords were receiving was 0.6 of CPI on their investments. So that's where that number comes from. Is it still appropriate to be using that number now that we're so far away from the third quarter, which was 1975? We are almost 2 quarters out from there. Is it still appropriate to be using that? I'm not certain. I don't know if anybody's looked at that or if we've gone back and revisited what the costs versus expenses are and what landlords are receiving on average nationally. However, the core here is that it's not necessarily based just purely on income, which you've pointed out is we've allowed on in-place tenants, you can raise the rent at a rate of 0.75 of CPI, but the NOI calculation also takes into consideration the rate of increase in your expenses.
That's the part I forgot, was that
Yeah.
those things can go up as well.
So some other aspects and considerations here, I think it's important to note that the calculation does amortize the cost of the capital improvements as an operating expense. And like I said, if the balance, it's that NOI calculation, and if in fact it is lower than 0.6, then the rent increases are ordered. So like I said, if the commission would like to look at these numbers, I think that it would be a good idea, and I think that we could do that at a future study session or a future item. We could really run some numbers, but I'll wait to hear from you on your feelings. So I've mentioned this a couple of times, the difference between net operating income and cost recovery. And here I've tried to summarize it a little bit on this last slide. And again, it does permits the amortized capital improvement costs to be counted as expenses. So you just roll all of your costs, you're financing everything up into those expenses. The amortization rate, like I said, is 30 years on that, and that's part of your calculation. NOI, it looks at the current year versus a specified base year. As I mentioned, it's 1983, unless the property owner can justify reasons why it would be another year. Most likely it's going to be a different year because, in my experience, not many property owners are going to have their records that date back to 1983. And then the increase is tethered to CPI. So we're tethering that increase to some standard that's out there. Versus the cost recovery process, this simply allows and permits the landlord to recapture some or all of the costs that they incur over a period of time. So it's not tethered to any standard out there. It's not looking at that, there's an expectation that they should be earning X amount, and if you're earning that amount, then therefore you don't get to take the pass-through. It just simply allows them to recover a certain amount of the costs. This also presumes that the landlords need the rent increase to complete the mandatory seismic retrofitting, whereas in the NOI formula, the landlord is required to prove that they need it. So that is, it's just a kind of a summary here, an initial, and I'm open to your questions, to your thoughts, comments, suggestions.
Just a quick question, maybe. If it's a NOI use, then it becomes a permanent part of the MAR, right? The increase.
That is correct.
And if it's a cost recovery, that's a surcharge. It's not part of the MAR, right?
That is correct.
So in that case, the landlord cannot impose the annual adjustment using that, whatever the amount would be for the cost recovery.
That is very correct, and it's a good observation. So if you are increasing the rent, you are in fact increasing the amount of new annual rent increases that the tenant's going to receive every year.
Okay.
Right? Because the rent goes up, but you're correct. With the pass-through, that is just, say, for instance, I believe in Los Angeles, it doesn't exceed $75 a month. That is considered separate from the rent, and so in Los Angeles, the annual adjustment is not calculated on that $75. It remains calculated on the base rent.
Rent.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, I have lots of questions.
Please.
So the first big broad question for me is the cost recovery, to me, makes more sense than the NOI. That it's just, the landlord spends X number of dollars for this large capital improvement. They divide it among the number of units on the property, and that becomes a surcharge, not part of the rent. To me, that makes more sense. I mean, I understand. It almost seems, you've got this note about under NOI, it permits amortized capital improvement costs counted as expenses. There's all kinds of accounting maneuvers that property, and they're all totally legal. I'm not saying anything's been in the law. Accounting maneuvers for landlords to take full tax benefits of any expenditures. So that one doesn't bear as much weight to me. But to me, the cost recovery, just for me and as a landlord, makes more sense. So then some smaller questions, and I have a bunch of these, and you can't answer the non-ductile question tonight. You're talking about if we do the NOI, there's the process for the landlord proving up that they need this increase in rent to cover their costs for the improvement. But there's also going to be, or there may be a mechanism in place where if that increase would place an undue financial hardship on a low-income tenant, I just want to make sure that the same kind of mechanism process where a tenant might just want to go, I don't want to pay that. And I don't want to pay that is entirely different from I'm on, SSI or some other form of very limited low income. I can prove it. Here are my tax records. Here are my SSI statements, whatever, but the tenant needs to go through a similar process to prove up the fact that they would be facing a financial hardship. It can't just be, I don't feel like paying it. And then on the second page of the report you gave us, it talks about an engineer reviewing the building, and I'm not clear on if that is a City of West Hollywood engineer that's doing that review, or if that is the property owner hiring a private engineer to provide that information.
Sure. So just so I'm clear, it sounded like your first two comments were statements, good statements that you want us to take forward and consider.
Correct.
Okay, and then the third is the question. That is not. That is the property owner brings on an engineer to conduct that report. The city does a peer review of that, and the Building Safety Office has brought on Dagan Corp engineers to do that, and so they're prepared for that, what they're understanding, and it's assuming rightfully so to be an increase in the engineering plans and reports coming through for seismic retrofitting.
Then also on the same page, this is also just a statement. It talks about the landlord's ability to use the PACE program for financing. And I know the PACE program, for those of you not aware of that, that is based purely on the equity in your property, not on your income. The payments go directly onto your property taxes. So for a property owner's perspective, the whole thing's tax deductible. Payments are. And I know there's been there's some bad press about that recently, about maybe some unscrupulous contractors kind of talking homeowners into improvements they didn't need and placing homeowners at risk. Honestly, it is a good program. I've utilized that program, so if you've read some bad press about the PACE program, take that with a grain of salt, that it actually is a good program that works under the right circumstances. Sorry, give me 1 second.
Before we get off of that
Yeah.
PACE, so all that's taken into consideration then under the NOI, because if it's the PACE program, how does that calculate in to the equation? Does the tenant benefit by the owner using the PACE program? The owner does, but does the tenant in this
Right,
equation?
so, and just, I've also used the PACE program, and I think it's great. A real value in the PACE program is the interest rates tend to be lower than you would get through the same kind of funding mechanisms or finance at that point otherwise. So perhaps one of the values, if you will, to tenants in the NOI calculation by using PACE is that the finance is at a lower rate than you could otherwise acquire. So because the financing is rolled into the calculation. Now it's amortized up to 30 years. Now if someone took out PACE financing for 10 or 15 years, I think that the formula would be based on the financing that they have on the property. But in terms of a benefit to a direct benefit or a real bona fide benefit to the tenant, no, I don't think that the PACE program represents that. This is a mechanism purely for landlords in order to get the improvements done at the building. Now, it's important to note that it's based off of equity in the property, not off of the property owner's credit. This is going to be valuable for those property owners that are earning lower income or that are extended or overextended in their debt. So it does free up and allow them to still receive the financing, and the financing at a lower interest rate. If you can imagine, if you have if you've extended yourself as a property owner, if you were based on your credit, might qualify for financing, but it would be at a much higher interest rate than the PACE program. So ultimately, end of the day, this is a good thing, but it's really going to be a good thing for the landlords and,
Yeah,
and a
I
good
don't
thing for the
doubt the
properties.
PACE. I don't doubt the PACE program by any means. I've also heard very successful stories about it up north. My old boss was a huge fan of it and redid her house, upgraded her house with it. But I guess I'm just trying to figure out if, and maybe it's a question later on for the same question I have is like if the landlord is going to receive some sort of benefit, I'm hoping that would be passed through, but that it may or may not work out in the numbers. It all depends on the numbers in the NOI portion. Okay.
Yeah, that's actually, if you don't mind, that's a very important observation, I think, that in the NOI, that is all calculated into NOI. And so any benefit, if you will, to landlord or tenant, it's all going to be in the NOI approach. That's purely looking at the whole picture for the building, the entire pro forma, the finances coming out of the building, looking at the expenses, looking at the revenues, and then ordering increases in revenue if they're lower than the expectation in the NOI formula.
Right.
No, that's okay. I couldn't figure out this anachronism, if that's the correct term, on page 4, footnote 3. I'll just read it so in case the public is watching. This is based on HUD area median family income from the Comprehensive Housing Affordability Strategy, which provides cross-tabulations of ACS data. What's
That's American
That's
Community
was.
Survey.
Huh?
American Community Survey. So
Which is-
it's part of the census. The American Community Surveys are done routinely. It's part of the census process. It's a very good source of data and information, and we use this on a regular basis to really keep a good measure and gauge on the needs within our community.
So if it's done during the census, that's every, how many years do we do one?
The American Community Surveys are done more frequently than the census, and this one, the data was based on the years from 2010 to 2014. So that's the most recent ACS data.
This next one is also just a statement. You talked about that one of the justifications for Costa-Hawkins passing was that landlords would be able to go to market rate when a unit went vacant, and then in theory reinvest some of that money back into the property. And you're talking about that, you know, they kind of need to prove up under NOI their costs. I'm just making a statement that I can point out properties in my area of the east side where the majority of the rents are now at, you know, market rate. And while the landlord may have fluffed the units as far as roofing, wiring, plumbing, sewer, heating, air conditioning, that has never been invested in. So I think it's a little disingenuous of some landlords who may cry wolf over the Costa-Hawkins being withdrawn, Costa-Hawkins staying, what we do with our money. So it's just, that's just kind of a statement that I wanted to make.
Just have one.
Can I actually
I
make
think
make
that
a-
is
can I-
actually my,
Can I wax a little bit on that?
Sure.
Because at this point, I just want to step away from this and be just very objective. Because I really don't want to put myself in any position one way or the other. But I do think it's important for the commission to be aware of this, because I think you also you point out a very important aspect. And this is when it comes into this, the policy and establishing the policy and weighing the values. Because this is very accurate, that Costa-Hawkins, part of the reason it was established was so that landlords had money to invest in the buildings. However, and we've seen the rent increases have occurred in the city, and we know that tenants are not, they're going to be reticent to pay more in rent. However, we need to look at maintaining and assuring, we need to establish good policy that assures that the buildings in the city are going to be maintained. We know that we have a limit on rent stabilization. That limit is July 1st of 1979. And those buildings are not getting any younger. They're getting older and older. And so part of the policy discussion and part of the policy that I would like the commission to consider and look at is how do we assure that we can maintain our rent stabilized housing stock, and what is that going to take? Because I know through the ACS data that the largest supply of affordable housing in West Hollywood is in our rent stabilized housing stock. And we need to keep that housing stock vibrant and healthy. And as you pointed out, landlords, we need the landlords to do it. But give it some thought. I think that it's worth the policy discussion on how the city can best do that. And your thoughts to the city council, I think, are going to be valuable on, is it a purely the landlords should be doing this because they've been able to raise the rents, or should we consider some form of a pass-through because we know that perhaps the landlords would be more receptive to that, and we know that the work is going to get done. So ultimately, at the end of the day, we need the work to be done. We need the buildings to be maintained. We need them to be managed. We need them to be seismically sound and fit so that when that earthquake happens, we don't lose our rent-stabilized housing stock.
I just have one question.
You don't.
done, thank you.
Go ahead. It's on the, he's done with his.
On the issue of buyout, could you explain, would the numbers sort of be based on, like the Ellis, for instance?
No. Landlords and tenants are allowed to enter into negotiations, and tenants are allowed to agree to accept some dollar amount in order to move. What we want to do is to create a process, a program that ensures that tenants know what their rights are under the Ellis relocation fee scenario, and that tenants are able to bargain in a manner that gives them a fair advantage. We don't want to hear stories about tenants that accidentally take a relocation fee of, for instance, $5,000, because that is lower than what they would otherwise be qualified for. And so this program, our staff attorneys are developing it, and they're bringing it forward. So I don't have all the specifics of the program, but it's first and foremost ensuring that tenants are aware of their rights, and then providing measures and protections in place so that they can exercise their rights.
I just wanted to add that, I just think this will be a blow to affordable housing. It's going to cost to upgrade. The costs are going to have to be passed on. It's just the bottom line, it's higher rents. To me, it's very alarming. And yet we do have to make our buildings safe, and I don't think there's any way out.
Well, I'm sure over the years, there's been buildings that needed new roofs or needed to rip out the piping and replace old piping. I mean, I'm sure there have been large, expensive, problems with buildings that people weren't applying for the net operating income, that we have currently on the books, because maybe they had costs to cover it. Maybe they thought the process was maybe just a little bit too cumbersome or required too much information. I think the upcoming information sessions will be really illuminating on what actually is going on. But I mean, I see obviously that we have a concern about there's this new law coming on the books where they have to do it. But I have to think that people have replaced roofs or replaced old pipes and done very expensive repairs on buildings previously.
It seemed to be a more simple process long ago, where if you had a capital improvement, you were entitled to increase that. If you could prove, you could increase that rent 10%, and that was basically the bottom line. But it seems like it's certainly more complicated now, and will be. And I'm so concerned about people who will need affordable rents. It's not, I don't think it's going to be an easy problem to solve.
Peter, since Costa-Hawkins went into effect and vacancy decontrol started, can you tell us how many requests we've had from property owners through this process? I think only one, right?
Yeah, for how many upward rent adjustment requests we've had?
Since Costa-Hawkins has been in effect, and they've been able to...
I can't give you an exact number, but I'm pretty certain that it's about a handful at the most. It's a very small amount since Costa-Hawkins came into effect. Can I ask a question for the commission? Because I think I've heard a couple of times you might be interested in looking at the numbers and having a follow-up meeting on this topic. We could, what I heard essentially is looking at the calculations, but then also perhaps looking at some of the actual building costs out there and looking at some of the work. So I can tell you we have done that. We have a study. We've gone in and analyzed a handful of projects. So we've seen what kind of work is out there, the new roofs, the full window replacements in the buildings. And so I think that we can put together some information for you.
Yeah, because in the example you gave in the case study, the seismic retrofitting necessities that they needed were a new roof and then steel put into the walls. And that sounds to me like I've seen roofs being replaced. I've seen piping being replaced. So it seems like these, like you said, we could maybe replicate some of these things in what's happened previously.
Commissioner Buckles, you had some questions, and then we're going to go to you.
I will start with, maybe it's just something that I don't understand about earthquake insurance versus regular insurance and what they sort of cover or whatever, but it would seem logical to assume that your insurance costs would go down once you do this retrofitting, and maybe it wouldn't because you're not insured, under regular homeowners insurance or whatever against earthquake damage anyway, unless you have an earthquake policy. But can you talk a little bit about that and address whether the cost savings from insurance rates going down, because presumably your building would be safer, if that's also passed on to tenants?
I can't really speak to it because I don't know, but I'm taking I'm taking good notes for this entire meeting, but this is one of those items that I think that we should look into because I'm curious. I don't know if it would go down, and if in fact that's the case, how that could be achieved or realized for tenants. Absolutely.
Okay.
Great point.
My next question is why the division of like sort of amortization, I guess, of the costs is limited to 12% and then 12% and then 76%. And it looks like from the two examples in which the rent increase was approved, there basically wasn't very much left over in the third year. And I'm wondering if the 12%, and then like the rest is based on the assumption that like for most cases, those first 2 years of rent increases will cover the cost. But it seems like you could get into a situation where that third year is, just an out of control, increase.
Yes, and I actually have to apologize. Commissioner Bergstein had it right. So it is based on MAR. So it is 12% of MAR, 12% of MAR, and then the balance. So I apologize. We simply haven't had these cases. So it's new for all of us, to be honest.
Okay.
So could you just say that one more time? So it's 12%, kind of give us a reference.
Yeah, so I explained it incorrectly earlier. It's 12% of MAR. So 12% so if you have $1,000 rent, it's 12% of the $1,000. And then it's 12%.
12%
Increase.
of 1,012.
1,012.
And then year 3 is what?
Any remainder.
Oh, it still is, that part's still correct, right?
Yeah, so essentially the hearings examiner orders a $50 rent increase. So you can apply $12 the first year in this example. Is that correct? And then you apply whatever that 13 or whatever it is, 12% of 1,012. And then the remaining balance, be about $25, would be applied in the third year.
With that 10% or?
Right, correct, with the 10% increase, right?
Okay. Next question is, I know you said that you maybe haven't gotten to think about this that much yet, but do you know like what the hardship situation would look like? And I guess that's sort of a general question about what LA has done, what Berkeley has done, or whatever. Is it a situation in which the landlord just absorbs those costs? Do they get redistributed to the other tenants? Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, and what I'd like to do is maybe we bring that back because we did look at that in this report. So we did look at the other rent stabilized jurisdictions, and we did look at what they do for hardship exemptions. And I don't want to say that they all require the landlord to absorb the costs, but I believe that is one example. But we'll go ahead and bring that back so the commission looks at that.
Last question is just about generally what the primary livability concerns are. And that I think partly depends on what kind of renovations are being done, I assume. Like, we can understand the livability concerns involved in a new roof, but are there general things that might impede upon a tenant's ability to live in their apartment when these are done?
And this is related to the habitability requirements. Yeah, we've seen some examples of some larger renovation projects where, in fact, you end up with dumpsters in the subterranean garage filling up X number of parking spaces, and then in fact, then all of a sudden there's a bunch of building supplies in the other parking spaces, and the tenants are expected to park on the street, or that all the walkways are either filled with building materials or they're torn up, or a sewer pipe has to be replaced, and so the access into the main access down the drive into the property is jackhammered and opened. And although this work, as I mentioned, the sewer pipe, yeah, it has to happen, but what we'd like to do is have the developer establish criteria so that they're going to do the work in a systematic and methodical way and then close it up. Because what we've seen, for instance, in some buildings where you've had a complete rewire of the project is they got out all of the interior hallways, and we've seen examples where they've left that in a big pile in the middle of the common space. Well, we'd like them to pull that all together and get it into a dumpster, clean it out. There's no reason for those piles to be in those spaces. And I don't think that it's any fault at this point on the developer's side of things because, as I said, I think that I'm a strong believer in being as clear as we want on our expectations. So this goal of the habitability requirements is for us to be as clear as we want, as we can, on our expectations for maintaining habitability to property. And I think that most developers will follow those requirements.
I guess the last thing is just a comment. Like I share Commissioner Maggio's concerns about that it could lead to some pretty substantial rent increases that could have a significant financial impact on people. But I think, you know, an earthquake could just be absolutely financially devastating to a lot of people, especially, you know, you have a large earthquake, everyone in the city is affected by it. Like, you know, there just aren't places to go, you know, huge costs that your insurance doesn't cover. And I mean, there are a lot of experts right now who are speaking about how incredibly unprepared Los Angeles and, you know, the Southern California region is for what is likely to occur, whether that's in 5 years or 50 years. Obviously, like, we don't know. And so, yes, I think that ultimately these are realities that we have to deal with as people who live in Southern California, and we will have to face some hard decisions, but, you know, people's safety and you know, their livability, I think, are of paramount importance.
I wanted to follow up on the insurance. Are we going to be able to get information? I'd like the question on insurance, and do you think we're going to be able to get some information to see if that actually happens? I know in my own case with my automobile, because I only drove 2,500 miles last year, I got a 35% discount. I thought that was pretty cool. So
Yeah, I'm going to look into it. I can't guarantee that we will have any conclusive information on it, but I think that it's an interesting point, and we need to consider all aspects and parameters.
Yeah, and maybe, I mean, that's the one we think of most that kind of stands up immediately, but there are other similar situations like that where, you know, you do this and you get a discount here, something like that. But, and especially how that's relevant, I think we all can understand how it affects into or calculates into the calculation of the net operating income one, but then how does it or how does it affect our other, you know, the cost recovery, things like that. So just how it plays into the big picture it would be
Probably
helpful.
just a question you could ask the California Earthquake Authority. I forget whoever issues earthquake policy in the state of California. They probably have information on file that it's been their experience that these insurers, once you place a policy with us, they can offer a reduction in policy.
Commissioner
Yeah,
Thompson?
thank you, Chair. It's just to share that, and it's indicated in the report, the cost recovery, for example, in San Francisco is the owners can recoup up to 100% throughout the 20-year period, and the monthly payment would be $30. In the city of Los Angeles, it's only $38 per month for a 10-year period, and this way the owner can recoup 50% of the costs. So it seems like a less complex formula. Again, we don't know how they arrived to that. Of course, there have been some numbers run, etc. NOA, based on the NOA cost recovery, it kind of makes me nervous because I don't know, you know, how the numbers would be used and what the formula will be. And maybe here, Manager Noonan will bring at the next meeting sometime in the future some sort of examples or samples or some, I mean, cases that we can at least see the figures, because I know how cost recovery works in LA, but I don't know how NOA would impact our residents here when we historically have higher rents, especially now. The rents are going really high, and how that's going to impact the current renters, and how that's going to impact the long-term tenants who are on very fixed income, and obviously any increase of that scale will definitely have a huge impact. So I'd like to get some numbers, of course. That would be great to see that. Clearly, this is something that will be necessary in our city to have to ensure the safety for the renters, and that will also ensure that the buildings will be probably safe for another decades. That's the goal. It's kind of a win-win situation for the tenants and the landlords, but at the same time, I want to, I want to talk a little bit about the rights of the renters and the tenants, because it's going to have a really big impact in terms of the rent increases. But you touched the tenant habitability aspect of it, and for example, the parking situation. If the parking becomes unavailable for the tenants, I think that's one of my main concerns in West Hollywood. You don't have parking, and the streets are, there's no way you can park on the streets. It's just impossible. Even if you have a permit, I see tenants, they just on my street, they just circle around for 30, 40 minutes to look for a spot, and and by having a parking space taken away because of this work, what in city of LA they do, and I'd like to recommend that we use the same kind of a maybe structure, is that parking, storage, any facility or appliance or privilege that would impact the tenancy during this retrofit work would be included in a tenant habitability plan, and then whether it's going to be a rent reduction or a compensation or something used, so those services that the tenant loses during this time will be compensated for. The City of Los Angeles also has enforcement and investigation section, which in case if the tenant habitability plan doesn't include, for example, reduction for parking or reduction for storage that was lost during this retrofit work, that section of the department will pursue a rent decrease outside of THP, so which is equivalent to rent decrease application in West Hollywood. So I would recommend that if to include that in a tenant habitability plan for the retrofit work, so then we ensure that tenants have parking and they have storage.
Can I interrupt just because I think that's probably something that we all, if I'm understanding correctly, I think that's probably something that we would all agree with, so maybe we could just all kind of make that clear, that we wouldn't want to, if the tenant if the tenant today were to be able to make the argument that I've lost this service or lost this parking spot, lost this storage area, and go through a hearing and get their rent reduced based upon a lack of diminished service, we would expect that same exact right to forward through even during a tenant habitability plan. Even if they're renovating the building, if the tenant loses those services, they should still be just, that should still carry through, those rights.
Right. I just don't want that, I know that's not going to happen, but I just want to emphasize that and have it as a recommendation that this retrofit work will not kind of diminish or take away that option of giving a, kind of rent decrease if the parking space or storage or whatever is taken away during that time. So is this going to be a mandated, a required work that the landlords have to do in the city, so they cannot say, oh, because the code requires me to do this, so I don't have to reduce the rent for parking. So that's
the cases we've seen where people have said, oh, because of the code enforcement made me take away this patio or made me
because it was illegal patio or illegal service, right?
Yeah.
So that argument, and I clearly I don't want to see like a $1 formal rent reduction or something for cases like that if things, if it's a required work to do. So that's the important part that I wanted to bring this up. And again, I don't really know how NOA would work, or I know how cost recovery, at least in LA, and now I see in San Francisco works. So I want to see what will be the kind of a analogy for West Hollywood for the cost recovery, or I don't know if we can come up with some sort of maybe numbers, or it's premature, but maybe in the future discussion when staff brings some numbers for us to review, maybe we can, have a further kind of a review and discuss.
Commissioner Charity, did you have any?
No, a lot of my questions were asked previously. I only have comments, and I can defer for other people for questions if they have questions.
I think we're done with questions and I mean, I have a few. I'll go through my list, but if you have anything else on your list, no, okay. Then just a couple of the things. So, I too, I think the idea about bringing back more data, I would consider it in like my head like case studies, like examples of, you know, if we did this, then these are some of the examples of that might come out. And you may not have them right now or even in a week from now, but maybe after the meetings with the public, and you kind of come back and you've compiled our stuff and the public's information, because we're going to see this again after that, right?
Yes, right now you'll be seeing it on March 8th, and at this point, I'm really thinking that that's going to be the ideal opportunity to have that second follow-up and look at the numbers.
Yeah, that way you've heard from the public as well, because they might have, you know, they're heavy on one idea that you might want to show some examples to us on. So I do think we'll benefit from that. Habitability, that issue, I kind of see it as these are things that we are maybe in a disorganized way or less organized way doing now. It's just that it would be similar to kind of a standard when a development happens. You know, they have to submit a traffic mitigation plan, and they have to do this plan and that plan. This will actually be a plan that they submit that in this next month, while you're listening to the public, you're also gathering some important things to keep an eye out for, like the things you might want to add to that list that says, you know, tell us how you're not going to block parking, or tell us how you're not going to make somebody's apartment smell because they've moved the dumpster over to their yard or their window. Those things that the tenants are concerned about now or can think of, those will all be kind of incorporated into what staff is expecting or can tell the developer, have a plan for this, because this is a concern. So is that what you're talking about when you talk about expectations? Because right now we already have traffic mitigation plans, we have all these plans that the developer has to do.
Yeah, of course, and yeah, let me clarify a little bit, because we do also have expectations for habitability.
Yeah.
But what we don't have is a systematic upfront process that's embedded within the planning application and the building permit. And that's what this is going to do, because right now we do have expectations for habitability, but what can happen is a developer, and there's no scrupulousness involved in this, it's just simply the nature of how developers pull permits. They come in and they'll pull the permit when they need it. And oftentimes many of the permits can be over the counter, or they can be day permits. But in sum total, for instance, we go out to a site and it was a number of permits pulled. They were all pulled incrementally or one at a time. But in fact, it turns out to be 50% of the units are being gutted and renovated. The building hallways are gutted. They're doing a new roof and they're restuccoing the property. Okay, so perhaps any one of those permits in and of itself doesn't have a great impact on the livability at the site, the habitability of the property, but all of those taken into consideration create some habitability challenges that we want to make sure that the developer is aware of up front, so that they can provide that habitability up front. They're aware of it. It's a set standard. You know, one of the ideas, or one of it's a tiered approach that we're looking at. So we know that there are some permits that they will be issued over the counter if the developer meets a series of criteria that's attached to the permit, just like with some of our other requirements, then they should be free and clear. There's going to be other projects that the magnitude is large enough that we're going to ask them to submit a specific plan that's tailored to that project. Many of these seismic retrofits should, you know, if it's small enough work, it should fit into tier 1, where they will just meet certain agreed to established criteria. However, for those larger projects, we would ask them to submit a plan that we'll review and ensure that habitability is met on the site.
That's great. I mean, I just see this as kind of like one of our, almost one of our easiest tasks, because the city already does it on an individual basis. This is just kind of allowing the city to prepare for what could be, you know, 50 applications one day of different buildings, and you're not going to be able to go through each building, so this is kind of a plan to just get ready for that. so everyone's
Yeah,
on the same-
that's a correct assumption of this project.
When we talk about, costs and the NOI and that calculation, what we haven't talked, and we've talked about increase in costs and all that stuff, what we haven't talked is the value in the property that a change may make. And I've been, 2 years ago when we first heard LA talking about these retrofits, I just assumed that these were things that were enhancing the value of the property, that were going to stick with the property owner for years to come. I've been told that that's not actually, it's not like building a extra garage on your property that now you have this to show for and its value. It's almost like you don't get a whole lot of increased property value out of what we're talking about, these retrofits, just simply the seismic retrofits. So, but still, in my mind, I'm thinking there must be some value to it, to the property, because I'd rather buy a property that's already retrofitted than a property that has not been retrofitted. So that alone would have a value to it. Are we whether it's that or replacing a roof that would have a clear increased value of or increase the value of the property, where does that calculate into either the NOI or the I don't have it on my screen anymore. I don't know what the cost share.
We'll look into this further. I can tell you initially, I don't think that the future value in the property is considered.
Okay.
And let me look into it further and also develop some reasoning or some thought behind that as well.
Yeah, because I mean, and I wouldn't be the only one. I mean, this conversation came up in the LA issue or with the LA retrofitting negotiations, but it just seems like if the property, like the tenant doesn't have value in the property. I mean, the tenant, yes, gets to live there, but when the property owner sells and they bring in the money, I mean, we shouldn't have to pay for all of, I'm not saying none of, but we shouldn't have to pay for all of this, this enhanced value to the property. I clearly understand what you had just kind of reiterated to us about, these are our affordable units, and the most affordable housing in our city are these that fall into the RSO, and we want to preserve them, and we want to make sure that we have a system in place that is fair and encourages landlords to maintain their buildings. But I also think that we need to take into consideration whatever ultimately gets changed in this is that there is added value to the property owner too. I mean, there's much more of an incentive for them to, or there is an incentive right now for them to fix things and to bring them up to code and all that. I too want to make sure that we're aware and understand fully how, I think the NOI process and calculation, as costs go up, we understand that. As costs go down, we understand that. And if an insurance policy, you get a savings there, that's all going to affect those numbers. I don't know how it affects, I'd like to see how it applies to other options we might have if we did a cost-sharing process. I also have concerns about, I liked the, what is the word I'm looking for? Not this NOI, but the cost sharing?
Cost recovery.
Cost recovery, thank you. The cost recovery, I like the concept that cost recovery allows the landlord to recover the cost of that expense, and then that's it. So they put in all new air conditioning throughout the place. That makes sense. We all kind of share that cost. I'm not one to go right for 100% pass it on to the tenant, but I understand if there's a cost passed on. But once that is over, I kind of feel like that should end. It shouldn't be just carried on in perpetuity. That's one of my concerns. And I believe that is probably about it.
Chair,
I'm really interested in finding out what the public, or what both the landlords are going to say in these meetings, and also what the tenants are going to be most concerned with. And that's what I hopefully at the end of this conversation, maybe we can talk a little bit about those to make sure we are reaching out to people, because I think that's what I'm kind of waiting for when we come back and regroup on this before it goes on to council, is to really take into consideration what the landlords are saying in real life, what they're feeling and what's happening, and then what tenants can afford, what they can't afford, and that very good question of who absorbs in those situations where a tenant, we offer some sort of program where the tenant qualifies and they're low income and they're not going to get a rent increase, but is that fair to the landlord who has, not been one of those who only rents to rich people and is willing to take somebody who might be lower income? I don't want to punish them in that process. We should be fair to them in that. And have we ever thought about outside the box of not just what we've talked about tonight, but can the city establish loans and whatever is? I don't have any specific suggestions, but have we explored things like that, and will the city explore things that will promote the goals of our overall housing so that we don't lose these units in the long run? And we also don't lose our tenants who can't afford the rent increases. But that's kind of where I'm at.
Just to support what you said about the future value of the property, and I like the idea that staff will probably look into that to see why in the city of Los Angeles they use 50% of the donor can recoup 50% of the cost versus 100%. Let's say in San Francisco, maybe in LA, they looked into that aspect of the future value of the property. So that makes really sense to look into that as well. Because cost recovery seems like a more easier way to understand, and it's like, as you said, you pay for years and you're done with it. That's it. So it's more simple way.
Maybe one of you can answer this, but so in LA, when we're talking about the 50% and the $35, we're just talking about the earthquake retrofits. I don't know how their other processes work, but I believe they are different, because that was a negotiated deal between tenants and landlords with the city. So is that what they use across the board for, let's say?
You mean different programs? Like capital improvement or something? The capital improvement, I think the cap is $55, the maximum.
Okay, so there are two.
If you want, we can bring that information back on March 5th. We have it. We've looked at it.
I just don't want to see it pinholed into this 50% thing,
Yeah, so we can bring that back, because we did a study. We looked at capital improvements, and so we do have a good summary of all of these different programs, and we do have the programs from Los Angeles in that report. So we'll bring that back to you.
And how in West Hollywood we do the capital improvement, I also want to, see that in comparison with, let's say, LA, San Francisco, or Berkeley, or the cities that you're going to use.
My only quick comment is I just want to entertain to the commission that possibly the upward rent adjustment is fine as it is, because we aren't the city of Los Angeles, it's West Hollywood, and there's a huge demand for housing here, and we're in a historic rental market where rents are sky high. And we've had something on the books in the city for a long time which hasn't been utilized, possibly because they don't need it, possibly because the rents are covering buildings from the 70s needing new roofs, new wiring, new piping, water damage. I'm assuming buildings from the 70s have had major capital improvements over that period of time, and that they were able to cover it from their rents. So, for me, not knowing so much about, so many unknowns with the numbers and what could happen. I think we're obviously going to see what the market can bear with this new law coming in April. Shooting from the hip, it seems like the city of Los Angeles is getting it right with splitting 50-50 because there's a benefit to the tenant and a benefit to the landlord with these improvements. But the other part of me says we're just not the city of Los Angeles, we're the city of West Hollywood, and it's a little bit different here. And possibly we're getting it right because here we are sitting as the Rent Stabilization Commission where, our values are keeping people in their homes, making sure, these rents aren't going up so much to displace people. But also we're looking at this upward rent adjustment, which is purely for the landlords and the property owners to make sure that they're getting a proper return on their investment. And we're here to make sure that, this is going to be fair for them to improve these buildings. And maybe they can bear it. Maybe the rents are just that high. And when these, units turn over and they're charging a market rent, that they can afford it already. And that's why they haven't been applying for this over the last few years.
Comments? I would say I agree with you absolutely. The only thing is, it would be interesting if, I don't even know if the city has the ability to do this, but to get an inventory of the buildings that we have here, and which, sometimes you can't just look at a building and say, oh, it needs this, 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 and this. But does the city, I know they've done the historic preservation, incentives, all those things to kind of help rehab buildings and stuff. Maybe it's just verbal surveys that they've had with property owners. I don't know, but any data like that would show whether are they making those repairs, those big repairs, or are they just doing what they need to do to make their tenants have running water and.
So we did look at that in this report. As I mentioned, we looked at some of those cases in this study. So we'll go ahead and bring that study to you. We looked at capital improvements. So it does not have seismic retrofitting in this report, but we did see that a number of other projects did include seismic retrofitting when they did other capital improvements. So I think it's a value to look at the report, look at the case studies that we looked at in terms of costs, and our consultant ran some pro formas on what the dollars would be for those capital improvements, such as replacing the roof and new windows and plumbing, electrical. We won't I don't want to guarantee one way or the other, but I most likely won't be able to give you some sort of a compilation of all of the seismic retrofitting projects that have happened, because they're not always plugged into our permitting system as seismic retrofits. It's, foundation repairs or the replacement of support posts, but it's going to be just embedded in the description, and there's no, so we might not be able to key out every single
Yeah, I'm not looking
retrofit.
for specific stuff. I'm looking for the permits pulled for random repairs on a building that we didn't tell them to do, that they were doing it on their own. Kind of like what Commissioner Charity is talking about.
We could pull all of the building permits. Like I'm saying is I just couldn't, I don't think at this point I'll be able to sort out what was for seismic retrofitting and what wasn't.
Yeah, no, that's what I'm saying. I don't believe I believe that the city has the data. I don't believe the city has hired a consultant to go through it and be able to tell us for sure what it all means, or have they?
That's the point that I'm making, is that it might not be possible to do because of the nature. The permits will be with a description, and the description may or may not say that it's related to seismic retrofitting. So we could pull all the permits that relate to, for instance, re-roofing or to replacing support beams, or it would take us some time to do that, but we could sort out and do that. But we wouldn't necessarily know what the nature of that job is, because the contractor came in and said, we have to do this. We have to replace these support beams. And we don't know that it's in fact for seismic retrofitting the project, because we don't have any requirements.
We're missing each other. I mean, I'm hearing you.
Well, tell me again what you're looking for.
I'm not expecting anything from you on this. I'm just, because I don't believe the city has it, otherwise we would have heard about it.
What exactly are you looking for?
I'm trying to get an understanding of whether people who own rent-stabilized buildings are or are not making capital improvements to their property since Costa-Hawkins. Most, the word of mouth is, no, they're not reinvesting that money into the property. I don't know that for sure, and I don't expect you to necessarily know that, but that would be what I would be using in terms of the question of, do we even need to change the policy?
Well, let me ask you to, just so that we can provide you with something to use. What would you want? A percentage of building permits where they did or they didn't, or number? Because it's happening.
That's what we're
It
missing.
is happening.
I'm not asking you for anything.
Josh, it's happening, and I have case studies that we have in this report. But if you wanted, I'm not sure what beyond the case studies and the fact that it is happening, if you'd want to know that there's X number of buildings that have been gone through a process, or if it's a percentage, or if there's some
I'd much rather
value or
hear from
measure.
50 property owners throughout the city to get their perspective on whether they have or haven't done it in there. I mean, because yes, they could, be falsifying the numbers, or whatever, or they just don't want to make the improvements. That's fine, but I would like to hear from them to find out, because there's not going to be any specific answer, because if you give us all you have.
Sure.
But I'm not asking you to do any work. That's what I'm
I
saying.
pull all of the building permits that are issued in the city every year to run a housing report for the finance department. So we have the capacity. It's just within it's in the description. So I'm happy to just, we can pull a representative example of the types of permits that come through every year. We can try to do a little bit more.
So you have this information that you've reviewed. In your opinion, based upon seeing that, is it necessary to change this?
I'm completely objective at this point because I don't have enough information one way or the other. I can tell you that it's happening, but the reason that I kind of sussed out a little bit more from you is that I don't know exactly what the qualification or quantification would be that you'd want to know on those. Because I know it's happening, I just don't know at what rate.
Could I ask, is there any way to pull, there's permits are pulled for smaller projects, but is there any way to pull or to show permits that were pulled where an entire building has had all new wiring, where it's gone from fuse system to breaker boxes, where an entire building has been replumbed and new sewer lines? Roofing is a little different. I think there might be a way to show, I think it's a specific permit for earthquake retrofitting. So is there any way that the database can just pull out those larger projects that might give Commissioner Kirby some, it might give some better information?
No, do not pull any information specifically from me, because
for the entire
it
commission.
seems ironic that we're having this conversation when the city is spending millions of dollars hiring consultants to find out how we can incentivize people to improve their properties, but yet we're having a conversation that people are doing it on their own to a high enough level that we can't tell whether this is needed or not.
Well,
That's what's ironic to me.
For myself, I would leave off the high enough level because I don't know. I can tell you that
and no,
I
that's
see
what your answer was.
permits,
You weren't
but
sure.
I just
Which,
don't know what the rate is.
That's what I'm like. I'm not. Why am I the only one questioning this?
Well, it's not only are we don't know the rate, we also don't know what the new rents are in those buildings, and we don't have a full picture of what's happening there at the property.
Any other questions or comments?
No.
So I very much value what's going to come from the public. How is the city, and I don't want to get into like the down the road of like what language and how often you're going to send out flyers, stuff like that, but is there a strategy beyond the normal everyday distribution process that the city uses to really get people involved in this? Because this is such an important, I think, policy review, potential change, that I would hope that we would have a lot of input. And I think it'd be something that the tenants should be interested, but that the landlords would definitely want to participate in.
We've noticed all landlords and all tenants in our January newsletter, and we're releasing press releases. It's on our external and our internal calendars. And as we get closer to the dates, we will do email blasts to all interested persons. We will do email blasts to all landlords that we have email addresses for. It will be, we will announce it here, we will announce it at the council meetings, and we will look at other ways and means of spreading the word.
Are we connecting with the apartment association, or, I mean,
We'll
I say
be
that as
personally notifying AGLA and the California Apartment Association,
thanks.
and the Beverly Hills Greater Los Angeles Apartment or Real Estate Association as well.
All right.
Do
Thank
we
you.
want to mention that we do receive and have discussed and have offered recommendations?
You happy with everything you've heard, or get it all down? Well, thank you for that report, and thank you, everybody, for the discussion and the comments that you provided, questions. We'll move into the subcommittee update. Who would like to?
I have some questions about that, since it was, I did volunteer to serve on that as the landlord on this commission, but just some, if you can help clarify some procedural questions. I don't want to violate that pesky Brown Act, so how do we publicly notice subcommittee meetings? How do we stay in non-violation of the Brown Act? And how do we arrange meeting space?
So we recommend that you do not have to notice meetings of an ad hoc subcommittee, and that's what you have formed as an ad hoc subcommittee. So it's on a specific topic, and it's going to last for a specific amount of time. We would ask that the 3 members of the committee meet in a public area. Perhaps you could meet at the library, you could meet at Plummer Park at the community center, you could meet at Starbucks, you could meet at Joey's or another restaurant, but you can meet at City Hall. In the past, our subcommittees have met at City Hall, but that's really your choice. Like I said, there's no noticing in the meetings. We have established this report out on each agenda, and I'd encourage the members of the subcommittee at each meeting to report out on when you met, where you met, and the topics that you covered at the meetings.
Who are we reporting that to?
To the commission. This item that you're on right now on the agenda, this will be on all of your future agendas while the subcommittee is in effect. And I just ask that the members report out on those topics.
I should have jumped in right before your question, but Peter and I were conversing back and forth today. I think Yvonne was a little bit involved, not directly with me, but in your conversations. So it would make me feel more comfortable if the commission would oblige me in allowing this to go on our next agenda, so we can clearly define, just not have further discussion into necessarily the content of what we're talking about, but clearly define whether we want this to be an ad hoc committee or a subcommittee, because that definitely changes whichever one it is. I mean, it may be more appropriate to be one or the other, but whichever one it is fully defined as alters the way the Brown Act applies.
So how that would change the ad?
Yeah, if I spoke with the city clerk. In the city clerk's understanding, both are subcommittees. There is a standing subcommittee and a ad hoc subcommittee. A standing subcommittee you did not form. A standing subcommittee is on a specific item. It's for there's no duration to it. It just continues.
It'd be like the design review subcommittee.
You set up an ad hoc subcommittee, and that is for a specific duration. You can, I believe that at the last meeting, Commissioner Maggio did suggest 3 meetings. I did encourage you to have some flexibility, only because I think tonight is a good example. We are going to be bringing, staff are going to be bringing a number of topics to this commission, and I just want to make sure that the subcommittee has enough flexibility in its schedule that you can take on these other larger items that are clearly, strongly defined within your purview, and that you still have the capacity to do the work that you want to do on your subcommittee. Although I don't have, my will is not binding here, so it's really the commission's decision on how you do this. If you want to do, and say we'll meet for 3 meetings, 3 times, and then report back, you can do that. Just be aware that you have these other items.
And I'm not asking us to make that decision tonight, but I would like the commission to be very clear, because the discussion we had and what went into the minutes and we're not, if someone were to look at it, we're not very clear on how we should move forward with that. So I just want to have that discussion at the next meeting, just so we all know whether this is a standing subcommittee or a ad hoc subcommittee. And that's not changing anything that we've already decided that we're going to do or not do, but it clarifies.
But wasn't the motion to create a subcommittee?
Yeah, we only used the word subcommittee. We never used ad hoc. And we also never defined the number of meetings. We never defined I won't say we didn't define, because we did define what the topic is. The topic has to do with yes, thank you.
Yes,
but there was actually dialogue saying we should have 3 meetings. No, we shouldn't. We should be meeting at the public park, or we should be meeting in the office. I mean, there was a lot of discussion that we never agreed anything specific, but even since we didn't, there's a lot of question about a question in my mind, what that means in the end, because we didn't want to do things like, remember I had suggested that very specific goals and items to look at. We didn't incorporate that into the motion, but I also objected to having only three meetings, or I thought that was going to be too much of a burden on staff, and you didn't know if it was only going to take 3 minutes. Well, those are 2 different meetings, or meeting categories. Ad hoc is well-defined, very specific, and has those limits. So you
To
can
the
see the
number of
conflict
meetings?
there. Yeah.
Ad hoc would
Yeah.
have a limit
So
to
we don't
the
need
number
to
of meetings?
change any of the things that we decided. I'm not asking policy-wise to change it. I would just feel more comfortable if we clarified that if we truly think it's an ad hoc committee, we'd say it's an ad hoc committee.
I like
But-
the idea to be flexible if we need, more meetings, so to be flexible to get, extra meeting or 2. That's probably should be an option for us.
By labeling ad hoc committee, we're not saying it's 3.
Okay.
We're not limiting it.
Could I suggest that we move forward as if it were an ad hoc committee? We let the ad hoc committee determine how many
We
meetings
can't-
are
Can
necessary.
can we make a decision tonight?
In
should just
staff's
put it on our
opinion,
next-
in our
My
staff's,
issue was that we
Sorry.
we don't have a quorum for February 8th for the full commission to meet. It was going to be my suggestion that if the 3 members of the ad hoc committee were available on that night.
If we can make a
find
decision,
space.
if we can have this conversation and make a decision tonight, I'm fine with that. Otherwise, we should err on the side of it being a publicly noticed meeting.
in staff's opinion, it is an ad hoc subcommittee.
It is?
That's what
It is. In our opinion, it's an ad hoc subcommittee. This is a specific topic that you're going to be doing for a limited time. There was clear evidence in the minutes, which are, your official minutes is the video, and you discussed it being limited, that there's flexibility. You had one of the commissioners, David Gregoire, suggesting that we leave the nuts and bolts of the subcommittee up to the subcommittee members to determine how many times you meet.
All
the
those make
duration.
it a publicly noticed meeting. That's what I'm saying, is that there's conflict. So all I'm asking, well, what is staff's
The
opinion?
ad hoc subcommittee
I have
does
a
not need to
question.
be at a public notice.
Excuse me, I have a
meeting.
question. Is it your opinion that we can have a conversation about this tonight and establish it? Or should we,
What exactly do you want to talk about tonight? I just said that, in our
Can this-
opinion, we already think it's an ad hoc meeting.
That's not my
so-
question. My question is, is it appropriate, if I were to make a motion and have the commission pass a motion that said it is an ad hoc committee?
I don't see an
Appropriate.
issue with that. If you want to just clarify the fact that the commission created an ad hoc subcommittee.
Well, again, one thing you mentioned about the publicly noticed meetings, I really don't want to, that's what you're saying? If it's an ad hoc
Ad
committee?
hoc does not
there
need to
will
be
a
publicly noticed.
Yeah, so that's what I want to do. I don't want to, have a publicly noticed kind of a meetings there.
So I will make a motion that the subcommittee we created on January 11th clarify that it is an ad hoc committee, and that they're there to focus on that issue, and it does not need to be publicly noticed. However, I think she recommended that it be in the city of West Hollywood, and keep us informed about what's going
It
on.
was my impression that was already established. We just have not
It
used the
wasn't.
word
I was
ad hoc.
It was not clear, and so that's why I'm asking, so thank you for.
And you could always continue a subcommittee, even though a subcommittee will meet 3 times.
Okay, Richard, we have a motion on the floor.
What do you mean, like?
No, I didn't,
Let's
we
have
do
a
not have
second
a motion on the
then
floor.
discussion.
We,
Do I have a second or no?
I'll second the motion.
Thank you. Is there any discussion about it?
yes, I think we've already clarified it, and I think we're making it more complicated.
Is there
We
any
just
other-
have not said ad hoc. It's a temporary meeting, and we will come back and report to the commission. If we need to continue a subcommittee, we can.
Richard, this is just clarifying for the record.
Is that it?
That's it.
Any other comments, or?
I just don't really see the necessity of it, because if the motion was to, to establish a subcommittee, and we did already at the last meeting, so it's still not clear to me if it's not public, if either way it's not publicly noticed, then we're not restricted to number of meetings, so, I don't really get the point to be honest with you.
That's the question I'm trying to resolve, is that ad hoc committees do not need to be publicly noticed. Subcommittees do. It's black and white. Subcommittees need to be.
Staff will jump in to say that a standing
I haven't given you the
subcommittee-
floor, all right? I'm sorry.
Sorry.
We just had training a couple weeks ago.
Standing
Chair,
subcommittees need
but
to be noticed.
really, to me, it's a question.
No,
I want
you
to
can
know.
ask him, but I hadn't finished my question, my answer. So that's where it was the 2. So that's why it matters to me, is that we're operating correctly.
I see.
But you can ask.
Mr. Noonan, I'm sorry, you're trying to make a comment?
Asking you a question.
Manager Noonan, if you can explain, please.
This is from our city clerk. In fact, we could just read it. Essentially, though, it's a standing subcommittee would need to be noticed. A ad hoc subcommittee does not. So the commission established a ad hoc subcommittee at the last meeting, and so the language itself, and it's reading, this is in consultation with Yvonne Quarker. The group that you're referring to would be called an ad hoc subcommittee. There are 2 types, ad hoc subcommittee or standing subcommittee. The ad hoc subcommittee must be made up of less than a quorum of the commission, so 3 or less, and are meeting at a set period of time to discuss a specific subject. The meetings can be held anywhere and don't need to be publicly noticed or publicly attended. They should just try to meet in the city, Starbucks, Joey's, a restaurant, Plummer Park, etc. It would be great to get them to at least to commit to a set number of meetings, say 3 or 4, although we had the flexibility, because I think that on the floor was to come back on April at a specific date. I just wanted to warn you guys that there's a lot of information out there that we're going to be looking to you to provide on these different items. But in fact, there was the idea of meeting 3 times. So that being said, I'm going to step back. That's the information that we have from our city clerk. So it is a subcommittee that you formed. It's a standing versus an ad hoc. We believe it's an ad hoc committee.
Would a standing subcommittee be an example of the design review committee of the planning commission that meets kind of, it's a permanent subcommittee? Would that be a
Yes, that is a
standing?
great example of a
That
standing
is not what we
subcommittee.
are attempting to do
That
here.
is not what you are doing. Yeah, you are just forming a subcommittee to discuss a specific project for a limited time, and I think we understand that. But if in fact you want to clarify that, feel free to do that. We are confident you can do that tonight because we feel that this is an ad hoc subcommittee as it is.
Great.
So by its nature, it's already ad hoc committee, but if,
So there's
fine, if you
no
want a
harm.
clarification.
We have a motion on the floor. It's not a big deal to
But
vote
let's
for it.
just vote on that.
yeah.
It's not a big deal, I don't think so.
I'm ready to call it.
Okay, he's calling the question. Please have a roll.
Ready? Commissioner Maggio?
Yes.
Commissioner Topchin?
Yes.
Commissioner Charity?
Yes.
Commissioner Buckles? Vice Chair Bergstein?
Yes.
Chair Kurpes?
Yes, thank you all.
Thank you for clarifying.
We will now move into, I think it's staff comments, isn't it? Or is it commission?
Commission.
Public comment, no public comments. We'll go to commission comments.
Do.
Chair, if I may, Vice Chair, sorry. I just wanted to thank staff for the report, because this is a very, that seismic retrofit program, it's very complex matter, and to put this in few pages in a very concise and yet very clear way, and provide all that information that at least now we know what's, what to look for. I just want to thank you for that, Peter and staff who worked on the report.
I plan to attend the February information session, so if anybody is going to be there, I'll see you there.
Number of things. One, it's kind of a statement and a question at the same time pertaining to tonight's discussion. For earthquake retrofitting, there are automatic shutoff valves that can be installed on the master gas lines to a building. And for anyone who purchases a property with a mortgage, you have 1 year from the date of that mortgage to install that shutoff valve, or your mortgage is called. However, we have a lot of buildings in the city of West Hollywood that have been owned since before cityhood. There's been no new mortgages, so no requirement. So what that means is, while I have that on my property, and my property is protected, the property next to me is an older property, is not. If an earthquake hits and their building catches fire because the gas line ruptures, more than likely my property is going to be impacted. I've had the discussion at council level asking if we could make it a requirement that every single building in the city of West Hollywood must have an automatic earthquake gas shutoff valve installed. So I don't know if there's any way to include that in our discussion, or that you have with council, or if I need to bring that up separately to council again. But if we can include that in the discussion, I think that would be worthwhile. Quick question to staff. I'm just curious, you've been working on the database to end all databases. Any progress as to where we are on that having a completion that's with all the properties, all of the last time that they were, the units were registered, something that you've been trying to bring into the 21st century for a while? How's that coming?
Let me, I'll cover that in my comments after the commission comments.
And then next, I just wanted to give a particular kudos and shout out. I don't know who on your staff did the rent stabilization news, but I'm nothing disparaging, thank you, to the prior issues, but this one was just, page after page was pertinent, useful information, where it was medical marijuana or Airbnbs. So I'm not disparaging any prior ones, but this was really a great newsletter, so wanted to thank you for that. I got that. I wanted to make the commission aware there was an appeal of a lawsuit against Airbnb. It was AIMCO versus Airbnb, and I think that Amico is a management company that has Park La Brea, one of the largest properties in west of the Mississippi. They own Palazzo and some other properties. They were alleging that Airbnb was complicit in allowing tenants to break their leases by doing short-term renting. The court in LA County held with the management company. The appellate court just overturned that. So I don't have access to the full decision. I'm not asking for our city attorney to come and do a full report, but if they can make you aware if that is going to impact any of the rulings City of West Hollywood has on limiting Airbnb of full units within our city, if you can bring that back at a later date, I would appreciate that, if there is any impact. And then lastly, it's not really it's not a rent stabilization issue, but I have the microphone for a moment. It's a public safety issue. There's been a great deal of discussion over the last couple of years about pedestrian safety and bicycle safety, and the city has done a stellar job of installing some new crosswalks and some new signals. But what I want to say is that no matter how much we as a city or the state can improve these areas, it is up to individuals to take responsibility for their safety. I was not able to attend our last commission meeting. I was unfortunately at the rosary and viewing of my partner's 25-year-old great-nephew who was killed in a car accident on Christmas Day because the driver of the car was talking on a handheld phone, dropped the phone, and bent down to get the phone. And that was that. And there's nothing that any city or government can do to, there is a law in California, you can't have a handheld phone, but we can't monitor 24/7. So I just wanted to say that while we do what we can in our city, my opinion, just as a resident, we have to take personal responsibility for our safety. So on that note, I also would ask that we adjourn tonight's meeting in memory of Justin Cano, C-A-N-O, Cano. Thank you.
Any other comments?
Just a quick comment. Thank you very much to staff for the work that they did. It's pretty obvious that it was very comprehensive and it was a really big project. On a similar vein, I want to just sort of remind everyone of what my opinion is the importance of civil discourse in especially public meetings, and I think that our commission does usually a very good job of that. And I also think that, vigorous disagreement is important in democracy, but I think, and it's my opinion that we should always make sure that we're trying to be exceedingly courteous to staff who does a very, very good job. And that's all.
No other comments? All right. I guess that's it. Oh, I'm sorry. Now we're going to staff comments.
Thanks. I think first of all, I just want to express our condolences. It's always it's terrible, and that's a real tragedy. Just a quick comment on your question, which was about our what we've done as a deep dive into our database, and we've identified all of the properties, all the units that we believe have not been registered since Costa-Hawkins took effect. And we do have that database. It's ready. Just unfortunately, with the number of other items that we've had and a staff shortage, I'm still hiring up my project development administrator, who was Andy Lovano. And about 3 years ago, she went to the city council's office to help and support them on their staff reports. And that really created a gap that we have yet to fill. So that recruitment is out. We're hoping to do interviews in February and get that position staffed up, and I think that we'll be able to pick up some of this lagging caseload. So one of those items, which is the bringing this item up to the council with some next steps, notifying them of our findings of how many properties we believe haven't been registered since Costa-Hawkins took effect, and then notifying them that we want to then now systematically go through and double check and make sure that those properties are actually in compliance with our RSO requirement to re-register the property. Going forward, I'm happy to report that we are updating our master database. We're going all digital. Right now we receive paper copies and we're fairly paper heavy, but part of that digital upgrade is going to include a notice annually to the landlords of when their last registrations occurred. And so hopefully no landlords will be surprised or shocked by that they didn't know that they had unregistered properties. So that's just the quick update. Good. One thumb up. All right. 2 thumbs up. Good. And I'll keep you up to date as that item goes forward, because the commission did make a recommendation to the council, and that recommendation will go with that staff report when we can. Actually, I would like to just note that this next week, we do have one of our annual housing meetings happening on Thursday. That's February 1st. It's going to happen in Plummer Park in rooms 5 and 6. Each year we go out to the community and we share our accomplishments, our in housing. We share the status of the housing market in the city. We provide the rent increases, the number of units that we have accomplished in the inclusionary program, and those events are open to the public. We do provide some light refreshments, and it's an opportunity for the public to learn about our housing programs and then to also provide comments and feedback to us that we can then take into account when we develop those programs going forward. So that again is on Thursday, February 1st. It's at Plummer Park in rooms 5 and 6.
What time?
What time?
At, I believe it's 7 p.m. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, with that, we have a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
All right, we'll adjourn until February 22nd.